Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 50 Best Deep Space Nine episode video. So this video is a part of my coverage of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, where I have just recently covered every single episode of Deep Space Nine, one season at a time. That is, I have a video out for each season of Deep Space Nine in which I cover every single episode in that season. If you haven't checked that out, you should check that out already. So this video is just the conclusion, the celebration or whatever of my end of my coverage of Deep Space Nine. It's meant to be a continuation of that. It's not necessarily meant to be a standalone video. So I am going to just blather on and talk as much as I like, because these videos are more for long-time viewers of my channel, for to hear more of my thoughts after just watching Deep Space Nine of what are my 50 favorite episodes. So this video will not at all be short or succinct. It's going to be several hours long because I don't give a crap. I'm just going to be blathering on as much as I feel like. So if you would like something more short and succinct, I had already done a top 10 favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine. You can go check that out. It's like 15-20 minutes long. Although I make no promises or obligations that my top 10 are actually going to be the same as the top 10 I did before, because I did that several years ago. This one I did after my recent rewatch, so I was analyzing each episode, taking notes, and so the order of how I think episodes rank may change dependent on how I felt on this last rewatch, because you learn something new every time you watch something. So I'd already done my best and worst Minor Aliens of Deep Space Nine and my 30 worst episodes of Deep Space Nine. So this is when I want to get into some of the best episodes of Deep Space Nine, because Deep Space Nine, in my opinion, is the best Star Trek show. It is one of the, if not the best science fiction show of all time. I love Deep Space Nine with a passion. So now let me rightfully get into the best of the best. Now this is going to work the same way my other videos I did worked, where a number will flash out before I get into certain episode rankings that will have the rating that I gave these episodes 1 through 10, because I gave the episode a rating of 1 through 10, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best, and so that's the grouping these episodes will be in my top 50. So you'll see a little number flash up that will tell you what ranking, what rating the episodes I'm about to list off have. So let's go ahead and get this thing started. Okay, so let's start with my number 50, When It Rains. So When It Rains, Season 7 episode that's in the 10 episode story arc that closes out the season. This episode in particular took place after the Defiant was destroyed, after the Dominion took back that whatever that planet was called in Cardassian space. And after the Breen joined the war, so everything looks down and dire, and things don't look good. But the one shining example, one shining little ray of hope, is that Damar started a Cardassian resistance. So the Federation rightfully recognizes that's their own best and only chance. So they send Kira and Garrick and Odo to this resistance cell to try to help them and give them tactics, because it's very ironic, of course, having a Bajoran telling Cardassians how to fight a war, but she has skills and experience in fighting those kind of resistant type battles. So that was interesting. And then you also got Gowron coming to the station and giving Martok like this great prize, but really it's just an excuse, because Gowron wants to take over the war because he's sick of he doesn't like that Martok is getting more prestige than he is, and so Gowron does a lot of strategies that are specifically designed to humiliate Martok, so that he will have a better political advantage. But in doing so, like the Klingon ships, are the only ships that are resistant to the Breen weapon. So in doing so, they're severely hurting their chances of winning the war. So I love the whole story arc of that ended out the season. I thought it was amazing. I love the serialized nature. I love how each episode blend into the other. It does make it a bit hard to judge these episodes individually, but not all of the episodes were great. There were a few ones that were just kind of okay. But overall, that story arc was amazing. And this episode in particular was a good setup. It was like kind of like a one part really that sets up into the second part, which I'll get to much later on my list. So this is a really good setup for that. I love the irony. I love how this is the second act of, if you look at these 10 episodes as a 3-act structure, this is like the second act where it's typical in second acts that the heroes are down in the dumps and are at the worst they've ever been, and it looks like the things are going really bad for them. It looks like they're fucked. In the third act, they like dig themselves out of that hole. This episode is that hole. Everything looks completely dire. Everything looks in dire straits. The Breen had come and turned the tide of the war. Sisko lost the Defiant. And Kira's trying to help out Damar, but he's obviously, kind of predictably, him and the other Cardassians are being dicks and not listening to her because they're just too arrogant to listen to Bajorn. And Gowron, of course, is just wasting away the only advantage that they have for his own political agenda. And I love the complexity of that. I love that's like totally in keeping in line with like dirty politics, and the analogy it makes with that is really good. So I think it's a pretty good episode. Anyway, let me get into my number 49 favorite episode, and that is The Siege of AR-558. This is another season 7 episode. This comes a bit earlier in the season. This is during the Dominion War. This is basically to show the horrors of war. It has to deal with a group of Starfleet Marines protecting this communications device, and how traumatized they are, and how they're overworked, and they've been there much longer than they should have because Starfleet resources are running thin. And Sisko and his group show up, and instead of, they're supposed to just supply them and leave, but Sisko sees the situation they're in, so he decides to stay and help them, and they have to fight through this really grisly battle. And I think the way it was set up, Nog gets shot and loses his leg, and it portrays the tragedy of that. It portrays war as not as a good thing, and that's a lot of other Star Trek or other sci-fi would be like, portray war as like, oh, this is a valiant battle of the heroes, good guys coming in and winning the day and defeating the evil villains, but war is actually a lot more complex than that. It's basically hell, and I think Deep Space Nine, particularly this last season, did a really good job of portraying war as something very undesirable, something that there are no winners, there are no heroes. And this episode is a really good example of that, with the dour music and just showing the personal toll that it takes on the people who are actually have to fight this on the ground. Now, when I did my season review, I talked about how this episode is borrowed. That's very, putting it kindly, it borrowed a bit heavily from Saving Private Ryan, which that is a fact. If you think that's not true, then you're wrong. You should watch the episode again and watch Saving Private Ryan. It's inescapable. And I'm talking about the last sequence in Saving Private Ryan when they're defending the bridge, not the entire movie. If you think I'm talking about the entire movie, maybe that's why you're getting confused. But anyway, regardless of that, maybe that's why it doesn't appear higher on my list. But regardless of that, I do think this was still a very effective episode, a very unique episode in the Deep Space Nine catalog. So anyway, let me go ahead and move on to my number 48, which is The Begotten. This is a season 5 episode where Odo has been a humanoid because he was punished by the founders a while ago. And he finds another changeling, like a baby changeling, and then Dr. Moore, the scientist who first discovered him, shows up, and they have Odo acts like a really angsty teenager in this episode. He acts like, "Fuck you, Dad, you were never there for me," kind of. And I actually like it. I think it works. I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's really interesting because he purposely wants to treat this changeling and teach it to grow differently than what Moore did to him, because he thought Moore hurt him too much and tortured him. And Moore is he is really offended by this, because he actually thinks of Odo as a child. He thinks of Odo as his adoptive child, and so he's offended that Odo hates him so much. But it's really interesting seeing the different style of these two butting heads against each other, because Odo in particular wants to treat it with kindness and not that same sort of. But eventually what they come to is a middle ground where they have to prod it a bit, because they have to prod it to learn. But he still tempers that a lot with talking to it. You have the beautiful scene where he's in the refill mat with the changeling in a glass, and he's talking to it and saying, "Oh, this is the refill mat." And Worf comes up to him and says, "Oh, Miss Constable, why are you talking to your beverage?" But this is actually a very touching episode, because even though it's kind of a hokey way for Odo to get his changeling powers back, when the baby changeling dies and it integrates itself into Odo and to give him his power back, even though it was a tad bit convenient way for him to get his powers back, that was actually really touching. That the changeling felt such a connection to Odo and did feel like he was a loving parent. And so its last act in the world was to restore his changeling abilities. That was great. It was a bit convenient, but it was also really touching. And also the way that Odo and Moore sort of grew to understand each other and appreciate each other more. The scene where Odo was drunk celebrating. That was a great scene. So anyway, let me move on to my number 47, which is Who Mourns For Morn. Now, this is interesting because Morn, I like the concept of Morn. I mean, he's always a background character, and he just grew and grew, but he never said a single word of dialogue, and the main reason for that is because they didn't want to pay the actor. Because they wanted to pay him an extra's wage, so they're basically being cheap. But it became a running gag, and people always talk about how Morn constantly talks, but of course you never hear him say a word on screen. And they've crafted a whole episode around him, but he's hardly in it. He's just talked about a lot, which is basically the whole thing about Morn, because the episode begins with him not there, and then he dies. And then Quark has his inheritance, and then you find out that he has his fortune, and all the other people who were in the heist that they got the fortune tried to, swindle Quark. So really, it's a Quark episode, and I think it's a very effective one. I tend to not like Ferengi episodes or Quark episodes, although I wouldn't call this a Ferengi episode. This is more of a Quark episode. I tend to not like them because they tend to be a bit goofy, but I think this episode captures the right blend of action, suspense, and comedy. Most Quark episodes lean too heavily on the comedy and get it wrong. They're not very funny. I have several examples in my worst list about this. But this, I think, actually captures it perfectly. I love how they play off the whole Morn gag, and they really accentuate it and bring it to the forefront. And the way it ends with Morn actually showing up and still being alive, and he's about to tell him what happened. Quark's like, "No, I don't want to hear it." The gag of him never speaking, but yeah, I just think this episode works. Anyway, let me go ahead and get into my number 46, which is Strange Bedfellows. So this, again, we're going back to the Season 7 10-episode ending story arc that ended out the season, which, again, I love this whole story arc. I thought it was great. This episode in particular deals with Ducat pretending to be a Bajoran, and he's like trying to seduce Kai Wynn, which I loved. I think I heard other people complain about this and say it was out of character for Kai Wynn. I could not disagree more with that. I think this was completely within her character. I think other episodes where she was being a bit more of a good guy, that was out of her character. This because she was always established to be a power-hungry egotist, and all she cares about is her own power. She doesn't really care about profits. She doesn't care about the religion she preaches. She just wants power, and this illustrates that perfectly. And Ducat, it's like the perfect match for her. He's another egomaniac who's power hungry. So I think this is great. It wasn't such strange Bedfellows, in my opinion. The other strange Bedfellows that the episode refers to, of course, is this is when the Breen, let's find out that they joined the Dominion, which changed the tide of war, which is really exciting. So a pretty good episode. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into my number 45, which is Second Skin. Now, I'm a bit surprised this made my best list because I always thought of this as kind of an average episode, but that is until rewatching it, because this is the episode when Kira is revealed that she's a Cardassian, and they say that she was an Obsidian Order agent who was under disguise, and the real Kira died like years ago. Thank God that turned out not to be true. Apparently some people, like I think Ronald D. Moore, I talked to my worst list about he has a problem with the retconning. Apparently he wanted to make this permanent, or some other writers wanted to make this permanent. Thank God they didn't do that. That would have ruined her character. That would be so dumb. But I think it works as a one-off when it is revealed that she isn't an actual Cardassian, and that this is all a ploy from another Obsidian Order agent in order to flush out a high prestigious legate, because it's his daughter who is the agent, and he wants to expose him as being a member of the Underground. So I think that works very well. But what I love most about this episode is Garrick. That's what when I thought this is a throwaway episode, I always forget about Garrick's role in this episode. When I watch it, I was like, oh yeah, the Garrick scenes are awesome. Like, it has this moment where Garrick's was, Cisco blackmails Garrick into going to Cardassia with them because he doesn't want to go, because of course it's very risky for him to leave the station. And I love how Cisco blackmails him, and Garrick is like, he outright says, like, I'm not going to help you. If it looks like the best way for me to save my life is to let you die, then I'm going to let you die. You're on your own. And, Sisko's like, Mr. Garrick, I do believe that is the first truly honest thing you've ever said to me. And he's like, how perceptive of you, Captain. Like, that's so great. And then at the end of the episode, Garrick kills the Intech guy, and he just vaporizes him. He's like, oh, what a shame. I rather liked him. It's like, Garrick is awesome in this episode. The stuff with Kira is kind of take her to leave it. Like, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's a bit dull. But the Garrick stuff, perfect. Anyway, let me go ahead and get into my number 44, which is Battle Line. So this is the season 1 episode in which Mike from Breaking Bad, Jonathan Banks, appears playing this. So they go to the Gamma Quadrant, and the runabout crashes on this planet, and there's this war going on, and they find out that Kaiopaka, who's like this Bajoran religious leader who's supposed to bring peace to Bajor, she dies, and so it all seems very pointless. But then they find out that she comes back to life, and then everyone around them who died comes back to life, and they discover that nobody can die on this moon. So they discovered that this whole moon is a penal colony. It was a punishment for these two warring clans who couldn't let go of their hate and just continue the fighting. They couldn't even remember what started the war centuries ago. They just keep fighting because they hate the other side for the recent transgressions in the war. So, and there are real life examples of this, of course. And so It was very interesting that this was a different play on that, where they literally cannot die, so they're just perpetually fighting this war forever. And Bashir, stakes are raised when Bashir discovers that people who were brought back to life by the nanotechnology on that moon will die if they leave the moon. So anyone who has died are stuck there permanently, which means that Kaiopaka is stuck there permanently. But she makes the best out of it, and she makes it her mission in life to bring peace between these two sides. Cisco tries, but he can't do it because it's centuries of bad blood. He can't undo it in a week. You need a lot more time than that. But they figure out, O'Brien and Dax come to the rescue, and so they rescue Kira, Cisco, and Bashir, but Opaka has to stay behind and she wants to make peace. And I thought that was a nice dark ending. This is when Deep Space Nine was really finding its dark tone that would really continue on to the rest of the series. So I quite like that episode. Anyway, let me go ahead and move over to my number 43, Necessary Evil. So this is a pretty good episode. I don't know if I liked this quite as much as some people did, because a lot of people put this episode really highly. I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of the detective noir genre, in which they really hammered that genre into this episode, where I don't think it necessarily fit. Like the whole Odo's logs, I think, were very noir-like narration. That's not really how he talks. He wouldn't make logs like that. But that being said, I still love this episode. I still thought it was a great glimpse of what the occupation was like, what Odo's role in it was like. It tells Odo's backstory and how he came to work for the Cardassians in the first place, and how he was distrustful of them, and it relates it to a modern day mystery with this Bajoran woman trying to kill Quark, because she hired Quark to get a list, but he couldn't help himself, and he looked at this list, so they hired an assassin to kill him. You get some funny moments with Rom, and just how they tie it in to Odo's backstory. It's a really good detective mystery story with Odo, which I really liked, and we get his backstory, so that's all good. Anyway, let me go ahead and move over to my number 42, which is The Homecoming. Now, this is the first episode in the Bajoran trilogy that starts out season 2, which I quite like. I really like this trilogy, actually. And this episode in particular deals with O'Brien and Kira going to this Cardassian penal colony to rescue a Bajoran prisoner. And it's really... I like the foreshadowing here, because at the very start of the episode, you have the scene where Quark is giving up this smuggler or whatever to Odo, and Odo is suspicious because it doesn't make any sense. He's like, why are you helping me? And Quark's like, oh, because we're friends. And then when he goes away, Rom's like, yeah, why are you doing that? And he's like, it's a rule of acquisition, whatever. Every once in a while, declare peace. It confuses the hell out of your enemies. And it's funny how they foreshadowed that, because later in the episode, when Kira and O'Brien rescue Lee Nullis from the Cardassian penal colony, Dukat shows up and they expect him to be furious, but he's like, oh, you're right, it's our fault, we shouldn't have Bajoran prisoners, so we're going to release the rest of the prisoners, we're going to formally apologize. And Kira and Cisco are confused as fuck. And it was foreshadowed earlier with the whole Quark thing. I love that. It was perfectly foreshadowed that Dukat was doing the same thing. He was declaring peace to confuse the hell out of the enemies, because we learn in next couple episodes that the Cardassians are currently working on a plot to, fund the Bajoran separatists, the Circle, so they can get rid of the Federation, so they can come back and take Deep Space Nine. So they're more worried about their other plot to retake Bajor, so they're going to declare peace here to keep their enemies off guard. I love that. That was great. And then you get the storyline of Lee Nullis himself, who everyone thinks is this huge, resistance hero, but he's just a guy, and he just happened to kill this Cardassian out of luck, and he's no hero, and he hates being called a hero. But Sisko says it doesn't matter if you're actually a hero. You're a symbol, and you need to live up to that because you can do a lot of good. You're in a position to do a lot of good on Bajor, which needs it at the moment. So I thought it was a really good episode. Anyway, let's go ahead and move over to my number 41, which is The Reckoning, I like this episode. Now, this is the storyline in season 6 that they start to turn the prophets into this fantasy-like struggle between good and evil, which doesn't at all match up with earlier seasons. But, that being said, I think this was a really good example of that. Probably the best example of them using the prophets in this manner, where they're having this. I love the foreshadowing of this really dire conflict between the prophets and the Pal-Rays, and they could destroy everything, and it's like foreshadowing of dark times. And Sisko has these urges because he's the emissary and he's going to set things in motion. You get some funny moments, because Sisko has this really ancient artifact and he just smashes it because that's what the prophets wanted him to do. But Kai Wen is offended because he thinks he's destroying Bajoran property and whatever. And you have this funny moment where after he destroyed the thing, he just said, "Oh, I had the urge to do so," and he's lifting it up, and Dax looks over at him and says, "You're not getting another urge, are you?" That's really great. And then the whole thing is that the prophets choose Kira as their vessel, and the Pal-Rays choose Jake, who of course is very much against what his father's doing, as their vessel, and so Sisko's in the position of sacrificing his own son for the greater good in order to help the prophets, and it shows his strength of character. And Kai Wen, of course, she stops the fight for her own selfish purposes because she's jealous that she wasn't the one chosen by the prophets. So that's great. Like this episode, I think it really works. Anyway, we'll get into my number 40, which is A Time to Stand. So this is the first premiere episode of season 6. It is part of the 7-episode story arc. The Dominion take over the station. So this is just coming off of the great finale of season 5. Now, a lot of people were disappointed in this episode because it's kind of slow paced. It's not like this because season 5 ended on such a huge cliffhanger conclusion, and then you come back to this episode. It's not really exciting. It doesn't really address it. It's just a slow build to get it going. But I like that. I think if you accept that, and the Sacrifice of Angels is really the huge payoff of which we get 6 episodes later. But this is good setup. I love the stuff that goes on in the station, where Kira and Jake and Odo are trapped behind lines, and they try to maneuver Odo to get on the council because he can use his sway with Weyoun, who thinks that he's a god, in order to affect positive change. And you have this one scene I really love where Dukat is showing his power over Kira and using that, and the way he touches her cheek, and it's "Oh, we will be good friends," and she smacks him away. That kind of drama is really well earned and really powerful. I really like that. Anyway, let's go ahead and move over to my number 39, which is The Circle. So, getting back to the Circle trilogy that started at season 2, this is the second part. I won't have the third part. I don't think that wasn't quite good enough to make my top 50. So this, I think, is the best of the trilogy. And because it deals with the Circle themselves, is a Bajoran separatist group who are isolationists. who are very weary of outsiders, and you find out, of course. And this is a good episode because it shows that the politician guy who's a bit of an asshole, who's the actor who was in Frostnik Sing, and Dave, who's like a good actor in this role. He always plays an asshole though, but that he was really good in this role, and that he captures Kira. He's actually in charge of the circle, and he captures Kira to try to get the intel on how best to take Deep Space Nine and how best to defeat Cisco. But he tries to win her over, but she doesn't budge, so then he tortures her. Like, that was very interesting. But what was really great, this was a mostly really suspenseful episode because it dealt with them discovering that the Cardassians are funding the circle. They do it through a third party, so the Chrysaris, so the Bajorans don't know they're being funded by their own enemy. But the irony in that is because is that by getting rid of the Federation, they're bringing back their worst nightmare, and they don't even realize that. And of course, by the end of the episode, the Circle completely take over Bajor, and they cut off Deep Space Nine. So there's no way for them to get this information to the Bajoran people that are about to get themselves totally screwed because of their own fear and prejudice. And that's just so powerful, so great. Anyway, let me go ahead and move over to my number 38, which is The Way of the Warrior. I know a lot of people would probably have this in the top 10. I don't think it's that good of an episode, sorry to say, but still a really good episode. It's a good standalone two-parter. I don't like the fact they made Klingons the villains of season 4. I've been on the record, but I think the episode should have ended with things going back to normal, which is odd for me to say because usually I lean the other way. But this is one example. I think this should have been a standalone episode. But as an episode in itself, it did really work. It was extremely suspenseful. It was a great way to bring Worf into the fold, his own personal character story of having to betray his own people and having his divided loyalties between Starfleet and the Klingons, I don't think was ever portrayed as well as it was in this episode. And plus you had other great character moments between a lot of other characters like Garrick and Dukat standing together, killing Klingons together. And that battle scene at the end, I must admit, was really well shot, well done, and very suspenseful. So yeah, that's definitely a really good episode. So now we get into my number 37, which is To the Death, 4th season episode, which first introduces the character of Wayun as the Defiant are forced to work with a group of Jem'Hadar to take down a rogue group of Jem'Hadar who threaten to wipe out pretty much everyone because they have an Iconian gateway. And I like the callback to the Iconian gateway, and I love the character interactions in this episode. This is one of the few episodes where you really see the crew of DS9, the Defiant crew, working as an ensemble and getting a lot of the great character moments. You had the whole thing of Bashir sitting in Worf's chair at the start of the episode, and then you have the whole thing with them having to work together with the Jem'Hadar and the differences in their culture. And this episode is the one that really delves deeply into the Jem'Hadar, into the Vorta, into Dominion culture and what it's like. I think this is where we really get a handle of how the Vorta think the changelings are gods. The way he sees Odo, I think is so, it really fleshes out the world, really great at world building. And overall, it's just a really exciting episode. Alright, so now let me move over to my number 36, which is The Search. This is the two-part episode that starts out season 3. This, of course, when they first introduced Dominion, and they first introduced the Defiant in this episode. And so Cisco takes the Defiant to go into the Gamma Quadrant to try to find the Founders. At this point, we don't know who they are. By the end of the episode, we find out they are, in fact, the Changelings, Odo's people. That was such a powerful revelation. The way it was revealed was absolutely amazing. This episode was just suspenseful throughout. The second part that dealt with like the alternate reality of the Vorder trying to test Sisko and how they would react to the political takeover of the Federation was didn't totally suck, but I think it was kind of weak, which is why this episode doesn't rank any higher to me. But it was still very powerful episode. Still amazing, the interactions between Kira and Odo, and Odo's whole story arc of wanting to quit Bajor, and then by the end of it, rejecting his own people because he sees how despicable they are. So that was quite good. Anyway, we'll move over to my number 35, which is For the Cause. Now, For the Cause was another very good episode. This is a season 4 episode where they suspect Benjamin Sisko's girlfriend, Cassie Yates, of being a smuggler for the Maquis, and it's mainly Michael Eddington who brings it to the attention, and he's very iffy because Sisko's not doing enough to go after him, so go after Cassie Yates, and so once they discover she is in fact a Maquis smuggler that takes Sisko away from the station, but you find out it's all ploy because Michael Eddington is actually an agent of the Maquis, and he wanted to get rid of all the senior officers so he could take over the station and steal the replicators that are meant to go to Cardassia. And that conversation you had between Eddington and Sisko at the end of the episode where Eddington was bashing Federation, bashing the Starfleet for being just as bad as the Borg and how they neglected the Maquis was so great. It was such a powerful conversation. It really made you look at the Federation Starfleet very differently, introspectively, see it from someone else's perspective, but at the same time, you despise Eddington for being such a traitor and such a turncoat in what he did, and you feel for Sisko, who was basically duped in this episode, which I think was quite powerful. So yeah, that was quite a good episode as well. Okay, so let's get into my number 9 rated episodes. So these episodes are all episodes that are excellent. So let me start with my number 34, which is Captive Pursuit, as first season episode where O'Brien meets Tusk. This is one of the earlier episodes, but I thought this was a quite good episode. It's definitely one of the best of the earlier episodes. I didn't actually liked it a lot better on this rewatch. I really saw the character of O'Brien shine through. Plus, I like the concept of the alien species that they introduced. How it was this guy who's on the run from these hunters, and it was part of their culture. And at first, the Federation didn't really get it, but then O'Brien slowly started to bond with this character, and he went to the point of risking his whole career in order to give Tusk an honorable death, mainly because he felt responsible for Tusk's predicament, even if he didn't quite understand it at first. But it was a good example of cultural differences and cultural understandings. It shows high points why the Federation is so great, and also high points why O'Brien was getting, and why Sisko is so great, because even though O'Brien was violating Starfleet policy, Sisko was ready, he was willing to just turn a blind eye because he understood what O'Brien was doing. So I liked that. I thought it was a pretty powerful episode. So next we'll get into my number 33, which is Treachery, Faith, and the Great River. So this episode was really powerful with Odo meeting Weyoum, who wants to defect, which is really out of left field storyline, really out of the blue storyline. Why would Weyoum want to defect? But then you find out that it's a different clone of Weyoum, and this clone somehow had a defect where it actually saw reason and wasn't completely brainwashed by the evil founders. But he still saw the founders as gods, but he disagreed with what they were doing with the war. He disagreed with the Dominion, and so he latched on to Odo as a god, and just the relationship that these two had, Odo coming to terms, he's always been violently against the Vorder thinking that he's a god, and this is something he's always fought against. And it's so great seeing this episode where he kind of comes to terms with it, because at first he's very distant, very cold of Weyoun, but during their journey of running from the Dominion, he learns to appreciate him, and he respects his beliefs at the end, even though he disagrees with it, and he gives this dying Weyoun clone his blessings, which was a very powerful, very well done scene. Now, the reason why this isn't high on my list, it's only in the 30s, is because it would be high, really, because that storyline is so powerful. But it also had the storyline of Nog trying to, get a power converter, whatever the hell they need to get the Defiant ready, and he takes this and he takes that, and O'Brien's like, uh-oh. Now, I didn't totally hate this storyline, but it was something that was a bit Scooby-Doo-ish about it, something that was very cartoonish about it, and I thought it really interfered. Even though they tried to have the same theme of faith, I think it interfered with the storyline of Weyoun and Odo, so that's why it doesn't end up higher on my list. So anyway, let me get into my number 32, which is A Call to Arms. So this is the season 5 finale. I thought it was a great setup episode, although, as I said, I looked in the IMDb, and this was rated in the top 5 of Deep Space Nine episodes. I don't think it's quite that good, because it's basically just a setup episode. But a good setup episode it really puts the pieces in motion. It really ramps up the tension to a high degree. Has Dukat and Weyoun and Dominion are coming for the station, and Sisko's trying to scramble at the last moment to get the minefield going. And also another reason why this isn't rated higher is because there's a huge flaw in this episode that really bothers me, which I talked about a lot before, so I won't get into it now. But just suffice to say that protecting the wormhole in Deep Space Nine should have been the Starfleet and the Federation's number one top priority. Any other concerns are very, very, not even secondary. They're third-dary. They're fifth-dary. They're minor excuse of protecting the mouth of the wormhole, which if you lose that, you lose everything, because Dominion can bring in a ridiculous amount of reinforcements. So that's dumb. But so maybe that's part of the reason why it doesn't rank higher. But I think it was a very exciting, very effective episode. Anyway, and it set the stage for what is the best, one of the best 6 episode story arcs, or 7 if you include this one. So I thought it was really good in that regard. Anyway, let me go ahead and move over to my number 31, which is Soldiers of the Empire. Now, it's funny because this is another episode I didn't think that highly of until the rewatch, because before I just thought of this as the Klingonest Klingon episode to ever Klingon. This episode Klingons the Klingons. It Klingons the Klingon out of that Klingon. It's such a Klingon episode. But watching it again, I really liked this. I thought it had a very strong through story. It had a very strong character story with Worf and Martok. Martok was actually kind of suffering from PTSD from his time in the Dominion prison camp, which makes all the sense of the world. Sorry for this term or phrase, but it actually humanizes the Klingons a bit for once, instead of them coming off as just a generic race of warrior. It actually shows depth and dynamic to them, particularly it shows depth to the whole Klingon culture, how it integrates this complex story of Martok suffering from PTSD and Worf having to choose between his friendship with Martok and his duties as the first officer on the Klingon ship, and I think it strengthens the Dax and Worf relationship, because Dax is she's lieutenant, she's more in tune with what's going on with the crew, and she can tell that they're fucking going insane, and that Worf and Martok are being kind of blind to this. But she makes Worf aware of it, but Martok is still completely, because he's too wrapped up in his own fears, his own trauma, And Worf has to basically challenge him to the death in order to get Martok to see this. And the way it resolves with Martok nearly killing Worf and then him like finding the strength to go into battle and strengthening the crew, it was such a great, powerful episode. And I think this is doing the Klingons right. I complained a lot about how they made the Klingons the villains in Season 4 and the beginning of Season 5, and I will continue to complain about that because it was a bad decision. This is what you should do with the Klingons. Have them be allies, have the Starfleet officers go on board, focus on them more and their characters. This is doing Klingons right. Anyway, let me go over to my number 30, getting into my top 30 with the second season episode, Invasive Procedures. Now, I've heard a lot of people not like this episode, or a couple of people bash this episode. I don't get that. I've always loved this episode. Watching it again, I actually loved it even more. I thought it was very powerful. So this is when, this Trill guy sneaks on the station when there's hardly anyone on it because there's some stupid storm thingy, and so only the senior staff has stayed behind. And this Trill hires some Klingon mercenaries and takes over the station. So with the sole purpose of stealing Jadzia's symbiont. And the reason why, and I thought this was a really intense, high tension episode that was pulled off suspense very well. And we had a few funny moments with Quark dealing with the Klingons. Like, Quark had his, he fucked things up in the first place, but he also had his moment to shine as the hero. But the reason why I think this episode is so good is because of Sisko's interactions, the character interactions you get, like the Bashir telling Jadzia that he's not going to let her die. Like, that was heartwarming. That was really touching. I think I did shed a tear for that one. But also, like, the Sisko had some amazing moments in this episode. He had such badass moments when he was, like, totally chipping away at what's-his-face is the Trill's girlfriend because he knew that he was going to leave her, and so he saw an opening and he just chipped away at her until he got to her. And it was so great because, Gerard, that's his name. Like, when he took Dax, he was just like, oh, we're friends, Benjamin, whatever. And when he was going to leave, and he was like, you're not going to shoot me, Benjamin, because you'd risk hurting the symbiont. And Benjamin just is like, don't call me Benjamin, and shoots him. That was a get up and cheer moment. I literally get up and cheer. I thought this episode was really exciting. I don't get why people don't like it. Anyway, let me move on to my number 29. Yet another episode I've heard some people maybe not say sucked, but maybe just a bit like think it's kind of average or below average, or just kind of a meh episode, which I don't get. Love this episode, and that is Business as Usual. I think this is probably one of the best Quark episodes. I ranked it as one of the highest Ferengi episodes, even though calling it a Ferengi episode is a bit of a stretch, but I wanted a good Ferengi episode from my Ferengi list, so I put this on here. Because I think it's a very good character story with Quark. It deals with the whole stupid storyline I didn't care about Quark, being disaccommodated from the Ferengi or having his business license stripped or whatever you want to call it. But it shows how desperate he's become, how his whole life hangs in the thread. So he's so desperate he's willing to become an arms dealer. And this, of course, alienates him from the rest of the crew. And you see his wrestling with the conscience. It shows what a dynamic character Quark is, that even though he tries to be and he thinks of himself as just another stereotypical Ferengi businessman and agrees all is important, that's what he keeps telling himself. But you see that there's something more to him than that. There's something underneath that he tries to deny, that he is in fact a good person. And I think this episode does a good job of showing how that inner side of him, who is actually a good person, slowly eats at him in the episode, because exteriorly he's like, I'm a Ferengi, I want to make money, I'm making money, so my life is great. But that conscience, that good person is inside of him, screaming at him and slowly tearing at him, and he has these like nightmares, which I think were done extremely well, that shows that he is not okay with participating in the murder of 5 million people. And so he finally realizes this, and he comes up with a scheme to like outmaneuver the arms dealer and gets the dude from Reservoir Dogs killed. It was so good. And I think there were some powerful moments in this episode, like his cousin trying to convince him, oh, who cares? It doesn't matter. Look at these stars. Who cares? Would you really care if one of them blinked out? But turns out he would. And so I thought this was a great character story. Great Quark episode. And plus, like, having the dude who, the arms dealer guy is like, Quark! Like, the way he was, like, hamming it up and outrageous. Beautiful. Loved it. Anyway, let me move over to my number 28, which is The Dogs of War. So this is getting back to the 10-episode arc that closed out the season, or closed out the show, I should say, that ended the Dominion War. This was the penultimate episode right before the finale. It had a very strong storyline of the Damar's resistant movement, like completely dying, getting fucked, and then Kira and Garrick and Damar are like trapped in the basement of Garrick's old housemaid, and they're just like feeling sorry for themselves and thinking it's over, but then slowly learn that the civilian population is on his side, so they just they decide to have a civilian revolution, and that was just such a powerful, such a dark storyline that I thought was done really well. And plus, you got Ezra and Bashir getting together, which I liked personally. I think these two really deserve to get together. But it's not higher on my list because you also had the Ferengi storyline. Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't hate the Ferengi storyline. In fact, as Ferengi storylines go, it's probably one of the better ones. Like, it has some good moments, like Quark paraphrasing Picard saying, the line has to be drawn here. And plus, I love the scene because there's all these reforms on Ferenginar, that more progressive reforms, like more equal rights, better environment, and stuff like that. And Quark is like very much against it. But every time he says, "Oh, this sucks," Rom just very quickly beats out a good rebuttal to him, and Quark just ignores him because he's too much in his head. I really like that scene. So I didn't totally hate the Ferengi storyline, so that's why it's still high, but it's still a Ferengi storyline, and it kind of brings the episode down a little bit. Anyway, let me go ahead and get into my number 27, which is Hippocratic Oath. So this is a very good episode from season 4 that shows O'Brien and Bashir crash landing on this planet, and they meet a group of Jem'Hadar, and it's led by this guy who is no longer dependent on the Ketracel White, and he seems like an honorable man. And Bashir can tell he's an honorable man, so Bashir is totally on board with his goal to reform the Jem'Hadar, because effectively, I think Bashir is very correct in thinking this, because if he was able to pull this off, he could effectively affected political and economic change within the Dominion, to the point of where if he was successful here, the Dominion War may never happen. So in retrospect, Bashir could have saved trillions, or maybe at least billions of lives if he was successful here. So that makes O'Brien seem like the brutish, ignorant grunt who's being an idiot, because he's just trying to fight against the Dominion, to Jem'Hadar, have him captive, and trying to escape over and over again, even though Bashir is trying to do the right thing here. But O'Brien actually does turn out to be in the right, ultimately, because it's implied, and I think it's pretty much a given by the end of the episode, that there's no way Bashir could have cured the Jem'Hadar. So that change that he could have affected and prevented the Dominion War actually was unattainable, because it's pretty much deduced that because the lead Jem'Hadar guy was assuming that it was something in the planet that made him free of the Ketracel White. But Bashir kind of came to the conclusion it was probably something that happened at birth, and it was just an anomaly, so there's no way to make the other Jem'Hadar that way. So it was a hopeless cause, and so O'Brien recognized that if they stayed on that planet, they would have gotten killed. So, in actuality, O'Brien was right. So that's a very complex, interesting storyline, and I love the O'Brien and Bashir relationship, how that put them at conflict, but they're actually really good friends. Like, the whole way that was played off was really good. And plus, there was some side storyline about Worf trying to do Odo's job, which, well, that didn't suck. It was fine, whatever. Anyway, cool. So let me move on to the next episode, which is my number 26, Rocks and Shallers, or however you pronounce it. So this is the episode from the Dominion War Takeover story arc. It's the second episode of season 6, where the Sisko and crew are trapped on a planet with Jem'Hadar. Now, this I thought was a very dark, intense episode, and it had this nice tinge of twistedness to it, because which I liked. I liken it to the 5th season episode, The Ship, but I think this is the much better version of that. I think The Ship kind of got a bit too dull, and I didn't buy it as much. But here I bought it like Dax was severely injured, and she was needed medical attention, and the sort of the conversation that Sisko's having with her, how they had this joke about, oh, enjoy your stay at the motel, madame. And she's like, oh, I want to complain about my bed. It's as hard as a rock. That was nice. That was a good moment. And plus, Garrick and Nog being taken prisoner, and seeing Nog act like this arrogant Starfleet cadet going, Nog, and reading out his serial number, where Garrick is being Garrick and spinning them a bunch of lies. Well, you see, I'm actually a member of the Cardassian. And they all saw through that. But it was all pointless, because the Vorta was running out of Ketchesel White for his Jem'Hadar, so it turned out he wanted to betray the Jem'Hadar and surrender to Starfleet. And so he's despicable, and Sisko knew he's despicable, so he tried to reason with the Jem'Hadar, but they were too brainwashed, they were too engineered to obey the Vorta no matter what, that they were actually went as far as to sacrifice all themselves. So it's just a very powerful episode. Plus, you had another storyline which is just as good on the station, with this Vedic putting a protest, and Kira and Odo's like, oh, we have to stop this, they're going to disrupt the peace. But it turns out the protest was just the Vedic hanging herself in public, which, there's some logical issues, like in the 21st century, can they really, not stop someone from hanging? As soon as she hangs, they could go over and rescue her. Surely they could use advanced medical technology to save her life. But leaving all that aside, that was such a powerful moment. That's when Kira realized that she's on the wrong side, that she needs to do more than just bide her time and wait, that they need to actively resist the Dominion. And that was such a powerful way to do it. Such a good storyline. So this is a very good episode. Anyway, let's get on to my number 25, which is The Adversary. This is the season 3 finale, which I thought was super intense, super suspenseful. This, to me, took the most advantage of the changelings being shapeshifters and infiltrators, where there was a changeling that pretended to be this ambassador and put them on this mission to the Zenkethi. I still don't like the fact that they introduced who the hell is Zenkethi. But anyway, he was trying to start a war with the Zenkethi. There was no coup on Zenkethi. He was just lying. And so they're out there Defiant. He took over Defiant and having them charge into Zenkethi's space, ready to start a war. And Sisko and the others are struggling to fix the ship, take control of the ship back, while having to deal with this infiltrator. And they can't trust anyone, because anyone could be the changeling at any time. It was just so intense. And then you had that ending where the changeling says to Odo, oh, it's too late, we're everywhere. And it was just a more ominous ending I cannot think of. That was just really good, really effective episode. Anyway, Let's move over to my number 24, which is Visionary, another third season episode. I love this episode, even though the time travel logic on it is a bit wonky. It's still a great episode, another good O'Brien episode, where he's traveling 5 hours into the future. When I do these weird time travel stuff, and they do it right, I think it's my favorite. I think it works extremely well. Voyager is an example that had a lot of episodes where they did these weird sci-fi time travel type things wrong, and it just didn't work because they didn't put the care into it. But episodes like this, where you can tell they put the care into it, because it has such a great character story with O'Brien. The fact that they use him, I think, was absolutely amazing, because you get a lot of great comedic moments of him, talking to his future self or talking to Bashir, with his dead body there. How could you let me die? Those moments are beautiful. But then also you had the storyline with the Romulans coming to interrogate them, and turns out they're the ones who are trying to destroy the station to prevent the Dominion from coming through, which actually turns out they were in the right. They could have saved trillions of lives if they actually did succeed. But leaving that aside, that was such a good storyline. Plus, just in general, the character interactions was just top notch in this episode. You had great comedic moments with Odo and Cisco, where Odo's I always investigate Quark and stuff like that. It's just top notch character interactions, top notch comedies, and great sci-fi twists. I mean, what more do you want in a Deep Space Nine episode? Anyway, let's move over to my number 23, which is Crossover. So I talked about the Mirror Universe in my worst episode list with The Emperor's New Cloak, which is ugh. But I disagree with the sentiment that all the Mirror Universe suck. In fact, I own Deep Space Nine. In fact, I think the Crossover was actually, it recaptured the intensity, the high tension level of Mirror Mirror, the way no other Mirror episode has done since. Except for maybe Discovery, but not getting into that. But this really captures that trapped in this weird, fucked up universe. And plus, I think it does it better than Mirror Mirror, to be honest. Not saying it's a better episode, because it's not, but I think it captures that tension better, because Mirror Mirror does come off as, especially since it's from the 60s, it comes off a bit campy, a bit cheesy, where this doesn't come off as campy. Well, maybe some people would say it does because it has the intendant or whatever. I would say the other DS9 Mirror Universe comes off as campy, but not this one as much. I think this one definitely less camp than Mirror Mirror. I think the tension level is a hell of a lot higher. You have the characters, the actors are definitely having a blast playing these different characters, Cisco playing this less than moral mercenary who's working for the attendant, and that's more creative than he usually gets, and I like great quotes like Carrick saying, please don't make me use some foolish euphemism. Such great, perfect moments, the very memorable moments. And as I said, the high tension of Bashir and Kira being trapped in this fucked up universe, and Kira meeting this evil version of herself that's basically Gul Dukat. She's basically everything she hates. And to see her have to deal with that and have to escape that, that was absolutely amazing. And I think the other Mirror Universe episodes were kind of just either dull or shitty. This is the only one I think that actually really got right on Deep Space Nine. Anyway, let me move over to my number 22, which is Rejoined. Now, I've heard some opinions of people not liking this episode that much, or thinking it's kind of dull or boring. And some people told me, you only like this episode because the romance involves two women. No, that's not true. I like this episode. I do like the commentary, the meta commentary it makes on homosexuality discrimination, because it doesn't reference it directly, but it references similar taboo where two people who are in love are prevented from sharing their love because of society norms. Whether you agree with those norms or not, I think it's pretty I think it's pretty evident, it's pretty universal that it's not right for society to pass judgment on two people who love each other like that. So in that way, it does mirror the homosexuality discrimination, but it does it while showing a same-sex couple. Unlike episodes like The Outcast, which were too chicken shit to do that, this episode actually does that. And plus, like, just leaving all that aside, like the personal character story that Dax goes through, and the way that Terry Farrell plays this, I think is some of the best acting she's ever done on the show. And I think that has a lot to do with Avery Brooks directing, even though I am and still will remain, regardless of anyone else says, critical of his acting of skills as a TV actor, as a film actor. He's more of a theater actor, and I am very dubious of some of his acting abilities, but his directing abilities is always great. Every time he directs even a bad episode like Fascination, you always see a elevation in quality of acting. And I think this episode in particular is probably the best example of that. Like the scenes where Jadzia and Lenore Khan were like trying not to kiss each other, but they end up kissing each other. Like that was played so well. Like I can think of no other romantic scene in the entire show that felt as powerful, felt as real, felt as kinetic, just the whole way that scene was shot. And then also you got the scene where Cisco was warning Dax that she could ruin her life, but then Jadzia was like, I want to do it anyway. And he was like, if this is what you want to do, I will back you all the way. And that was such a touching, powerful scene. I think the friendship between Jadzia and Benjamin was never portrayed as more powerful than it was in this scene. Like this whole episode, I think it was just such a powerful, well-structured, emotional ride that and the sad ending, like I heard some people complain, it's just episodic, they're resetting the button, but I thought that ending was perfect. I love the fact that I think if you're gonna do a romance of the week episode, this is how you fucking do it, because that ending where it was tragic, where Lenore Khan gave in to society pressure, where she refused to throw caution to the wind and follow her heart. That was effectively tragic. This was a damn good episode. I don't care what anyone else says. Anyway, let me move on to my number 21 favorite episode of Deep Space Nine, and that is Civil Defense. Now, I love this episode. I know there's not much to it, like beneath the surface. There's no greater, message or anything like that. And like the character stories are pretty surface level, but it's just such a powerful, suspenseful episode. Like I've never been such high tension, such high suspense than in this episode. And I think it's probably the best example of a disaster-style episode being done on the Star Trek franchise. Like the episode Disaster in TNG or Starship Down later on in Deep Space Nine, or I think Voyager might have had one as well. Like those were nothing compared to this one. This one I think takes the cake, because like the tension level just keeps rising and rising and rising, and to the point like every time they try to do something to stop this crisis, they make the crisis worse. I love that. That really brings something to it. And then of course you get the beautiful moment. It's like one of my favorite moments of the entire show is when Dukat beams aboard. He's acting all arrogant. He's like, you find that I don't take well to that tone. And he's just being such an arrogant ass because he thinks he has the upper hand. And he tries to beam out, and his own computer program stops him. And you get the message from the Legate, you're a coward. You should die like a Cardassian. Like, that was awesome! That was so awesome. Now, granted, the storyline was Quark and Odo being trapped in the security office, talking about how he's not really devious. It didn't totally suck, but it was kind of meh. And the ending was kind of just like, we saved the day. But maybe that's why it doesn't rank in the top 10 for me. Maybe that's why it doesn't rank higher. But it's still such a great episode, like that Dukat moment, and Dukat and Garrick like bitching at each other and like, blah, 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 blah. So good. Anyway, let me go ahead and get into my top 20. We're getting into my top 20 favorite Deep Space Nine episodes here, so let's jump into it. Let's start with my number 20, Change of Heart. Now, speaking of great romance episodes featuring Jadzia Dax, this one I think is highly underrated. I think it's extremely powerful. So you have, and I think this is definitely by far the best Dax and Worf episode. Like, this to me, I always like the relationship, but sometimes it's not done very well. Let he use without sin. But this is an example of how that relationship really works, and it's really the height of it. This is the best they could possibly do with it, and it makes such an emotionally powerful, like this episode. I can't understate how emotionally powerful this is, how effective of a love story this is, especially not just because most love stories are like deal with like fleeting love or whatchamacallit, like just crushes or intense, like you meet someone, you have feelings of infatuation. Like, this deals with a marriage, with a lasting romance, a lasting love, and it does it in such a great way. Where so Worf and Dax have to go on this mission to retrieve this Cardassian spy whose intel could save billions of lives in the war. He could literally save billions of lives, and Jadzia gets injured, and regardless of people trying to nitpick, this actually does make sense. I read some nitpicks online of this, talked about this in my review of this episode, and those nitpicks are bullshit. These people didn't think it through, but so forget about your nitpicks, they don't work. So Jadzia gets injured and to the point of death. So Worf has to make a decision. Does he leave Jadzia to die, or does he retrieve the infiltrator or the spy who could save literally billions, if not trillions, of lives? And at first the obvious decision to him is his duty. He needs to save billions of lives. He needs to stay true to Starfleet. But as he's walking, and this scene like gets me every time. And his heart starts beating very fast, and you could hear, like, they did the great sound design where you could hear his heart beat, and he couldn't do it, and he just goes like, fuck it, and goes back and saves her life anyway, even though by doing so, the spy who was putting his life on the line was killed because Worf was never there to get him, and billions of lives they could have saved, he did not. But he put his own wife's well-being. And that scene at the end where he's telling this to her, and she's like in the infirmary, and near, just to the point where she almost died, and Worf is like telling her this, and she's crying. She's like, "Oh my God, I can't believe I ruined your career." And he's like, "You come first." Like, I'm almost getting teary-eyed just talking about this. Like, this episode was just so damn good. Now, I would actually say this would be in my top 10, maybe even my top 5, if it wasn't for the stupid side plot. We get a stupid side plot with Bashir and playing Tango with Quark, and Quark distracts him by talking about how he has a thing for Jadzia and he lost her, which I think was dumb. I really hated that storyline. So unfortunately that brings the episode down a little bit, because if it wasn't for that, this would easily be top 5 material for me. But unfortunately it's not, but it's still top 20 material. It's still such a great episode. Anyway, let me now get into my number 19, which is The Wire. Now, this is a great Garak episode. I think it kind of is better in retrospect once you understand how great of a character Garak is, but I don't think that makes it any less of a great episode. Even though maybe the first time I watched it, I was kind of underwhelmed by it, but then when I went back, after knowing how awesome Garak is, I liked it better, but I don't think that makes it any less, because that's my own fault for not realizing how great of a character Garak is, because I think looking at now, judging the episode on its own merits by itself, it's a very good and powerful episode where Garrick is like, you have some of the best moments of Garrick in the entire show, where he's like drinking himself and getting drunk in the bar, and Bashir tries to trick him into going to the infirmary. He's like, what kind of fool do you take me for, doctor? Like, they had some amazing moments between him and Bashir, and also really defining the Bashir Garrick relationship, how Garrick like goes from high highs to like ripping Bashir apart and telling how much of a fool he is for thinking he's actually his friend when they're just having lunch together because he has nothing better to do, and to the point where he's like so like regretful and happy. It's like, oh, I love you, Julian. Thank you so much for being your friend. And anyone who's had to deal with anyone with a manic personality or has had a manic personality themselves will know how true to life that is, and how I think just how real that is to the people who are suffering from like manic highs and lows, and what it's like to deal with that. And I just think it was perfect. And also like the stories that Garrick tells, and he tells all these different stories about how he got exiled, but they're all conflict with each other, and at the end they all involve the guy named Elim, which of course we find out is actually his first name. And at the end Bashir's like, oh, which are true and which weren't? And he's like, oh, my dear doctor, they were all true, even the lies, especially the lies. Like that makes no sense. It's such a great line. It's so true to Garrick's character. I mean, this episode is so great. And then you have a Nabertain where Bashir goes to seek a cure from a Nabertain, and this scene was so creepy. It really establishes Nabertain as such a powerful, creepy guy. Like, he knows exactly what Bashir had for lunch. He knows what he likes to drink, and it's just like, it was so ominous the way it's like, oh, we can't have Garrick suffer now, can we? Because I want him to live a long life suffering at this and living amongst people he hates. And it was just such a powerful episode. Okay, God, these episodes are all very good. We're getting into the best of the best here. Anyway, let me move on to my number 18, which is Favor the Bold. So this is another episode from the Dominion takeover the station story arc. This is the penultimate episode that leads into the finale, or the final episode of that arc, which is Sacrifice of Angels. And really, it kind of makes a two-parter with Favor the Bold and Sacrifice of Angels is really one story. But, I got to separate all the episodes from the arc, so I can't really put those together. But this is perfect build-up. Like, this would be higher if it wasn't for the fact that it is basically just a setup episode, but it's such an effective, like, it does its job as a setup episode perfectly, as it ranks the tension where Sisko's trying to pitch his plan to retake Deep Space Nine, and like, Starfleet's very dubious of it, and I think this is a plot hole. They shouldn't be dubious, but I've talked about it. I'm not going to complain about that anymore. And it finds out that he gets the, Kira gets a message out from Mourn that they're planning on taking down the minefield, so Sisko no longer has any time. He can't wait for reinforcements. He has to go now. Like, that's just such a perfect way to rank up the tension. And plus, you have the storyline with Kira and Rom and Quark on the station having to deal with the fact that, the Federation's about to lose, and there's really nothing they can do about it. And they're trying to come up with some stuff to do, but then they all get arrested. It's just so good. Anyway, let's move over to my number 17, which is Things Past. This is, I think, one of my favorite, or if not my favorite episode that actually shows the occupation. I think it does it in such a dark way. And I like that Kira's not even in this episode. I think that's a bold decision to have this episode based in the Bajoran occupation. But have it centered on Odo instead, and have Garrick there, because Garrick is like at the start of the episode being all arrogant and how just dismissing the occupation, but then he has to actually be in the Bajoran shoes during this occupation, see things from their perspective. That was great. And then having basically deal with Odo's guilt, because I think Odo being working for the Cardassians, he must have done some shady shit. And it kind of annoyed me how in the first 4 or 5 seasons, or first 4 seasons at least, they kind of ignored this and played it off as if Odo was some kind of hero to the Bajoran people, where he worked for the Cardassians. So there should be some negative aspects to it, and I love this explores it more. I love how he sentenced the wrong people to die, and this is something that guilt was eating at him, and the way it's portrayed in this episode I thought was extremely powerful. Anyway, we'll now get into my number 16, which is Homefront and Paradise Lost, the 2-parter that deals with the Dominion coming to Earth. Now, at first I thought this episode was a cop-out because it was built up, the first part was built up as if the Dominion changelings were going to infiltrate Earth, and it was going to be this huge battle infiltration type thing, kind of like the Adversary was. But it turns out that that they weren't really planning to do that. They were just really having some threats so that Earth would be so afraid they basically ruin itself, that they let their fear get the better of them. And this is such a powerful analogy about fear and giving up civil liberties, such as Sisko's dad, who was like definitely did not want to submit to these blood screening because he thought it violated his rights, and to the point where Benjamin thought that he was a changeling because he refused, but really he was just against his rights being taken away. But then the next episode, after this power failure, he was totally willing to give up all of his rights, but it turns out the power failure wasn't actually from the Dominion. It was from corrupt Starfleet admirals trying to seize power for their own corrupt purposes, for their own power-hungry purposes. So this, this 2-part episode turns out to be the perfect analogy for 9/11 and 9/11 aftermath. It's so bizarre that it came out 10 years, or maybe not 10 years, but at least 5 or 6 years before that actually happened. So it's very, but it was just basing it off of other events in history and just the way human behavior is kind of really predictive in that manner. But even though it does predate the 9/11 aftermath, is such a perfect analogy for it, and such a great way, great point about why one shouldn't let fear get the better of them, and how dangerous it is to just willingly give up your civil liberties and your freedoms just because you're afraid. Anyway, let me get into my number 15, which is Far Beyond the Stars. Now, this is a really great episode. I used to have this ranked as a 10 rather than a 9, but I think watching it again, I think the reasoning for the prophet sending Sisko these visions is kind of very contrived, and it's just an excuse so they could have an episode set in the 60s. But that being said, leaving that aside, this was still such an amazing episode. It was so much care was put into the directing of the episode. I believe this is Avery Brooks again directing. So much care was put into directing, so much care was put into the acting. This really was a very true portrayal of some discrimination African Americans faced in the 60s, and I do like the juxtaposition of Sisko, put to his current situation where he's so downtrodden on the war, and how he's losing faith, and how it's showing him that to always have faith, and also have faith of the heart. And don't get me started. But also, the power of imagination, the power of, and I love how this episode sort of blurs the line between what's real and imaginary. So I do think this is a really great, powerful episode. Okay, here we go. Number 10 rated best of the best of the best of the best of the best, because I do love this show a lot, and this is the best of a great show. Let's get into my number 14 13, which is The Changing Face of Evil. So this is another episode from the 10-episode story arc that closes out the show. As I said, I love this story arc. This episode in particular was really freaking exciting. So this is the episode where Worf and Ezri return from being held prisoner to the Breen with news that that Damar let them go, but with news that Breen had joined the Dominion, and the Breen make an attack on Earth, which makes so the Federation has to go to the Chintaka system to try to defend it, because the Cardassians are trying to take it back, and it turns out that they are successful because the Breen have this powerful weapon, that energy dampener, and they weren't expecting that, and the Defiant is destroyed, which I was not expecting. So a very exciting episode, but it ends. And then you get more of the Dukat and Kai Wen storyline too. I think this is when Dukat kills her assistant Tabor because he's being a dick. He's actually being cool, but they're dicks, so they don't like people who are cool. And of course, Kai Wen has gone to the pod race. I think it was this episode. I'm pretty sure. But anyway, I know that this is the episode in which they suffered, the Federation suffer a huge defeat, and they think that they're all screwed. But at the very end, Damar makes this announcement that he is forming a resistance force on Cardassia, and they made attacks against the Dominion. He calls out for all Cardassians to resist, and that was such an exciting scene. I remember my blood pumping. I got so excited, and when those credits rolls, I was like, fuck! I want to see the next episode. That was so good. That was such a powerful, exciting episode. Anyway, let's get into my number 13, which is the magnificent Ferengi. So, yes, I gave this episode a 10 out of 10, and it's in my top 15. And usually I am very vocal about hating Ferengi episodes. So Ferengi episodes definitely in general are subpar to the rest of the episodes every week. I was like, oh god, there's a Ferengi episode. But this one is different. This, when I did my top 10 funniest episodes of all Star Trek, the entire franchise, this was number 1. And I stand by this. Like, it's funny because when I first saw this episode, I didn't really pay much mind because I was expecting it to suck. I was like, it was a silly premise. The Ferengi getting together to rescue Moogie from the Dominion. And I was kind of only half watching it. I hadn't seen all the episodes leading up to this at this point, so I wasn't entirely sure. I kind of remember sort of who Brunt was, and I don't know who the cousin guy was. But once I saw this in context and sort of just watched it and judged it on its own merits, I laughed my fucking ass off. This by far is the funniest episode in the Star Trek franchise. It's just joke after joke after joke after joke after joke lands. And this is like the antithesis, like the opposite, the complete total night and day when you compare it to other Ferengi episodes like The Emperor's New Cloak, where Quark and Rom are just not funny and their banter is really annoying and they have no chemistry whatsoever and they're just annoying. Whereas here, their banter, their chemistry is like perfect. It's like perfect comedy timing. They really play off of each other. Like, there's so many jokes that are absolutely hilarious, have me rolling on the floor like when Rom is begging Nog to join their little band group, he's like, but you know how to fire a phaser. And when they bring the Vorder on board the ship, he's like, hi, I'm Rom. and shit like that is just so funny. And then when they get the whole group together and Nog is like giving them a debriefing, and he was like, oh, sir. And he's like, oh, we don't need to stand on ceremony here. It's like, no, I meant you should call me sir. And Quark's like, we're all team here, Nog. And then Rom corrects him and is like, we're all team sir. Like, God. And this is joke after joke. And plus, the thing about rescuing Moogie from the bin, you have freaking Iggy Pop playing a Vorder in this episode as well. So I'm sorry, this is a rare example. And this is the awesomeness of season 6. Now, not every episode of season 6 was great. There were a few on my worst list. But in general, Season 6 was amazing, and I think it's the best season of Deep Space Nine, and that rubbed off on this Ferengi episode, although there's another Ferengi episode later in the season, which is the worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, which it didn't rub off on, but this episode, it totally did. So, amazing episode, amazing comedy, totally worked. Anyway, we'll get into my number 12, which is Inter Armen Emen Silent Legis. That's probably not how you pronounce it. This one's a really tough one to pronounce. The Latin, I believe. But anyway, this episode I actually appreciated a lot more on the rewatch. I always liked this episode. I always thought it was great, but I usually gave it like an 8 or 9 out of 10. But watching it, like with totally, analyzing it and just thinking about the episode, just sitting down and watching it, I could tell like how beautifully structured this episode is and how beautifully acted this episode is. And I like that it's very different in the Deep Space Nine Patreon because it just focuses on Bashir and a bunch of minor characters. It doesn't really feature any other main characters, and it continues the whole Section 31 thing. And like the intrigue, like this is like I think the perfect political intrigue episode. I think it's the best political thriller that Star Trek has ever done, ever. Even better than Star Trek 6. I'm going to throw it out there. And it's funny because the original story for this episode was supposed to be the third Next Generation film, but Rick Berman is a dickhead and wouldn't let them do it, so instead they came up with Insurrection, which sucked. So it would have been way better if it was the plot of this episode, because it was supposed to be about Picard and Data having a little feud, but here is Bashir and Admiral Ross. Now, originally it was supposed to be Cisco, but they realized that it would kind of degrade Cisco's character, make him less of a hero, which I totally agree. So even though Ross is kind of a side character no one cares about, I think it was a really wise decision to have Admiral Ross in this role. And it really, even though he's like a character I don't care about, he doesn't need to be that important because the story speaks for itself. The twists and turns in the story where Bashir thinks that Sloane's trying to assassinate this Tal Shiar, the leader of the Tal Shiar, so he teams up with the other Romulan to stop him, but then he finds out that Sloane was playing him the whole time, that he actually wants the leader of Tal Shiar to get promoted because he's in secret a Starfleet mole, where the other senator, which he thought was awesome, actually they wanted to get rid of because she's too much of a patriot, and so they purposely did that so he would go to her so she would get fired. I mean, that was so amazing the way they pulled it off, the way like Bashir figured this all out, that Ross was involved and went to him. Like that scene was just giving me chills. It was just so good. Anyway, let's go ahead and hold on one second. Okay, so let's move over to my number 11, which is Whispers. Always one of my favorite Deep Space Nine episodes. Love this episode from the very beginning. So this I thought was a very good O'Brien episode. It was a very good thrill. I love how it subverts expectation, and it plays because there's all these Star Trek tropes, especially at this stage. You got Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Continuum with Voyager, where you have all these tropes that the show keeps to recycle and doing, like the Trapped in the Holodeck episode, or the shuttle craft crash episode, and the trial episode and stuff like that. So, and this, you assume, is the parallel universe episode trope. It's an alternate universe, an alternate reality, because O'Brien shows up at the station after coming from the Gamma Quadrant. Everyone's acting really bizarre, everyone's acting strange, and so he tries to run away, and he calls the Admiral, and the Admiral's acting strange too, just like, go back to the station, will not be harmed. So you assume it's a parallel universe, but you find out that it subverts their expectations. It defeats the trope. It does something new and original. Instead, he's a clone. A clone. It's not actually O'Brien. It's a replicant, or how they call it. So it's a robotic copy of O'Brien who thinks he's O'Brien in every way, shape, or form. And I love that. I love, because that's who you follow throughout the episode. You see it through his perspective because you think that's O'Brien and everyone else is acting strange. And I love it how it gets you to assume that by following his perspective, because usually when one person is out of place, you would think there's something wrong with him. But the way that they portrayed it, the way they followed it through his perspective, through his voiceover, through his, his storytelling, the audience identifies with him and agrees, yes, something's wrong with everyone else. And I love that. And it turns out that no, actually, something's wrong with him, because that's not actually O'Brien. And the people were started sort of catching on to that, but they didn't want him to know. So to him, it just came off as they were acting weird. He could tell they were trying to block him out, even though they were trying not to let him know that they were doing it. And it was just so perfect. And that ending, I love this ending. I think the ending is true to Deep Space Nine. This is like the most quintessential DS9 ending ever, when this character that we were identified with, who we were following the whole episode, we find out that he's just a clone, and he dies. And he says, "Tell Keiko I love her," to the real O'Brien, which is, oh my god. Such a powerful scene, and that made the real O'Brien be like, what? And it was sort of a powerful moment for him, and it impacted our actual characters, because they come to realize that O'Brien realized that this is how he would have reacted if this was actually him, if he was in that situation, because this was such a perfect copy of him. Now let's just leave out, the fact that this alien species were able to make such a perfect copy of an alien from the other side of the galaxy that they just met. Leave that aside. It was just still such a powerful, good, disturbing, weird, strange episode, and that's what Deep Space Nine does best. So yeah, I think this is one of the best of the entire show. Okay, so now it is time to get into my top 10 best episodes of Deep Space Nine, the 10 best. So let's start with my number 10, What You Leave Behind. Now, What You Leave Behind, of course, is the final episode of Deep Space Nine, and I gotta be honest, this episode would easily be in my top 3. This is a top 3 episode, except for the fact that they had the stupid singing hologram pop up for a while, going somewhere, and they had this long sequence where they're in this stupid lounge. He's doing the stupid lounge sequence, and then they have these really hokey, emotional, like flashback sequences for each character. And Worf's one is really stupid because it doesn't even have Jadzia because it had rights issues, and it was going dun dun. One had all these. It was really hokey and cheesy and over the top, and plus the conclusion to the story line with Dukat and Kai Wynn was kind of anticlimactic, because there was a lot of build up and it was over too quickly and too easily. All Sisko had to do was destroy a book. And, well, I mean, he had to go to live with the prophets or whatever, but and that was fine. I didn't have an issue with that, but the ending could have been better for that storyline. But the rest of the episode was pure gold. It was gold. Like, this is what Deep Space Nine is all about, which is why I'm saying this would be top 3 for me if it wasn't for the stupid singing hologram and the anticlimactic ending, because this is the perfect way they could have ended the Dominion War. And it was so good because this is the end of the 10 episode story arc, so it was building to this episode, and I love that. I love that it wasn't just a standalone. It took balls. It really took balls for the showrunners to have their final episode, which is usually something just tune in for the final episode, but to have it be part 10 of 10. That took balls, and it really paid off because it was able to build off of all of the setup and really everything that closed out the show in the perfect way. Like in the Dominion War, like Star Trek has always been about, and Deep Space Nine in particular, has always been about war is horrible, war is hell, war is something to be avoided. So rather than having the good guys come in and win the day and be like, haha, we won, instead it shows the horror, it shows all the lives lost, and Cardassia was fucking decimated. They were like standing over tons of dead Cardassian bodies, and it's sort of exemplified in like the Klingons, because they see war like that, and Martok's like, oh, let's drink this, celebrate, and Sisko and Ross look around, and there's all these, they freaking Dominion, like, we're slaughtering Cardassian civilians by the thousands, and they looked around and like, yeah, no, I don't feel like celebrating. And that is perfect Deep Space Nine. That is essential Deep Space Nine. And plus, you got really great tie-offs to the, you had Odo making peace with the Changeling and going back to live with them in that farewell. Again, anyway, I totally disagree with people who do not like Odo Kira relationship. I think the relationship was amazing. I think that ending sequence where Kira has to say goodbye to Odo, I mean, that he puts on like a tux before going into the great length. Like, oh my God, that was so effective. That was so emotional. And then you have Jake having to say goodbye to Cisco, and it ends the whole show with showing Jake and Kira looking out into space. It was just absolutely perfect. Alright, so let's get into my number 9, Improbable Calls and The Die is Cast, as I'm counting these 2 episodes together because it's a 2-parter. I don't care, they have different titles. It's a 2-parter. Anyway, this is a 3rd season 2-parter where, God damn it, it's amazing. This has some of the best Garrick quotes, like particularly Improbable Calls. Like, it has some of the best Garrick quotes in the whole show, like the whole boy who cried wolf, never tell the same lie twice, and some oh god damn it, I absolutely love the whole thing where he's Garrick's supposed to go on the trip and Bashir is like, oh, is there anything you need me to do for you? And Garrick's like, yes, actually you'll find in my if you go in my quarters and you look in this thing, behind the panel is a false panel, open that panel, in that panel there's a rod. Now if I'm not back in 5 days, I want you to take that rod and eat it. And Bashir's like, what, eat it? You're joking. He's like, yes, doctor, I am. That's amazing. Now, apparently I heard, I didn't know this, that they originally were going to do a storyline about that, but they decided not to, and they made a joke out of it instead, which I thought was actually perfect, totally in Garrick's character. And of course, how Garrick blew up his own shop to try to trick Odo into joining the investigation, and Odo of course figured this out, because this is also a great Odo episode. It shows his investigating skills, and it's such a good way. And I love how when Odo pointed out to Garrick, is like, you blew up your own shop, and he was like shocked, and he's like, well, now I've never seen that particular expression. Of course he tries to lie, but Odo's already got his number, and that's so great. And he gets this other scene where Odo goes to this Cardassian informant, and is like in the dark, saying in the corner in the cliff, throwing him information. It's like, I will be indebted to you. Like, that stuff is cool. That's the kind of informant, like, Odo has his contacts. So you hear him talk about it sometimes. It was so great to actually see it. And of course, what this whole thing is implying is that the Romulans are going to war against Cardassia, and so he feels like he's uncovering a huge conspiracy. But of course, by the end of the episode, he finds out that it's not the Romulans going to war against Cardassians. It's the Romulans and the Cardassians are joining and making an alliance to go to war against the Dominion. Now, more specifically, not the Romulan government, but the Tal Shiar, the intelligence agency of the Romulans, and the Obsidian Order, the intelligence agency of the Cardassians, are making an alliance to go into the Gamma Quadrant to wipe out the Founders, thus putting an end to the Dominion threat, which is really exciting. And of course, Odo and Garrick get trapped on the ship, and Garrick is united with the Nabrantane, and he wants to impress him and show off. This is before they kind of ruined it by saying he was his father, which I don't really buy, but forgetting about that, he's just a mentor, and I think it worked really well, with Garrick, torturing Odo because he wanted to impress the Nabrantane, but you could tell his heart wasn't into it. You could tell that his time on Deep Space Nine changed him, even though he denied it. He didn't want it to be true, but you could tell that he hated having to torture Odo because it was pointless, because he knew that Odo didn't have any more information to give them, so it was a waste of time, and Garrick knew it was a waste of time, but he wanted to impress Nabrantane, so he went and tortured his friend, and it was so powerful, and by the end of it, Garrick realized that he was in the wrong. And of course, I love how there's a whole thing about the Romulans and Cardassians, like the Obsidian Order and Tal Shiar. This was set up for in the season 3 episode Defiant, because Tom Riker steals Defiant, goes to the shipyard where he knows there's no good, but it turns out they were building these Cardassian ships, and they're Cardassian ships that have a cloaking technology, and they're owned by the Obsidian Order, who are not supposed to own ships. But I guess Dukat, when he got the information from the Defiant, I guess he didn't figure this out. Or otherwise, he did figure it out and just decided it didn't concern him and just left it alone. But either way, so intense when they actually go to destroy the Founder homeworld and they find out it's a trap! And oh my god, that was just so tense. Like, I was like such on pins and needles with Garrick. It's like, it's a trap. They've been waiting for us all along. And then they reveal the Romulan colonel, Lovok, in charge of Tal Shiar. He was a changeling. He was actually replaced by a changeling. And that the Founders they didn't set up this idea. The idea was Nabarantain's, but they pushed it forward because they knew it was the perfect way to wipe out the Tal Shiar and Obsidian Order in one foul swoop. It was just, oh my god, the political ramification, the political war, the intrigue, absolutely beautiful, amazing episode. But the stuff with Sisko in the second part where he has to go into Gamma Quadrant to save them, and then Eddington tries to stop them. That was a bit hokey. Like, that kind of brought it down a little bit. But still a great episode. Still an amazing two-parter. Anyway, let me move over to my number 8. Sticking to season 3, let's get into Past Tense. Another two-parter from season 3. I also really love this. Now, I've been on the record and I've said up and down, I'll say it again, the time travel logic in this episode sucks. It doesn't make logical sense. There's ways they could have fixed it to make logical sense. But I still love this episode. Like, I don't care that the time travel logic is just awful, because the character stories, and that's why I watch Deep Space Nine mainly for like good analogies, good the messages that they have about modern day society, which, oh my god, it couldn't be any better in this episode. This episode came out nearly 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, and it's still relevant to today. You could argue it's even more relevant today than it was when it came out. And it's like it very rightfully predicted the trend of the homeless being demonized, and how that's a problem, and how that actually has only gotten worse over the years, because this episode takes place, like, Sisko and the others travel back in time to 2024, so that's just 5 years from now, and of course, like, a lot of the specific details, technology, of course, they were a bit off on. Not all of it, because they did have the internet and some other stuff, so there's some things they did kind of get right in Skype calls, but other things they got horribly wrong, mainly the wardrobe, come on now. But what they got totally right, the important thing they got right, was the sort of demonizing of the poor attitude and how that's become a problem. Some complain that this episode's preachy, but I think this is preachy in the best possible way. I think this is exactly the kind of preachiness I love and appreciate from my Star Trek. It's what makes Star Trek Star Trek. I think this is probably one of the best examples of that. And, just the character story of Sisko willing to risk his life, willing to give his life, basically, to correct the timeline, to make sure that this injustice is righted, and some great character like BC and the Hat and the other people who work at the sanctuary. Some have become jaded to it, and others are more sort of sympathetic. Like, the richness and the dynamics of the character dynamics and how Bashir and Sisko relate to them was just so perfect. It is so well done. That's why, this episode is just so great, and that's why I'm just willing to overlook, the time travel logic, which is really wonky. And you get some funny comedic moments, such as O'Brien Kier in the 60s doing the peace signs and beaming away while the hippies are tripping. Like, oh, come on. That's beautiful. That's classic. This episode is amazing. Anyway, let me get into my number 7 best Deep Space Nine episode, and that is Behind the Lines. So this is another episode from the Dominion Takeover story arc in Season 6. This is such a good episode. It's such a powerful episode. I love this story arc, but this episode is a really good high point in that story arc for me, because this is when the female changeling comes on board the station, and Kira and the Resistance want to sabotage the emitter so that the Dominion doesn't take down the minefield. And Odo has a part to play in the sabotage, but instead he's, off shape-shifting around with the changeling, and by the end of the episode he's like, I don't care, it doesn't matter, I'm a changeling, who gives a fuck. Like, that was powerful. I did not see that coming, and I think it was well earned character development. It's not like the whole Bashir being genetically enhanced, which was bullshit retcon, not earned. This was earned the way that Odo, because Odo's always been established, like in the episodes I was just talking about, Dias Cassie talked about how he wanted to go home, how he missed his family, how he wants to be with his people, and here you see that gets to him. That gets to him, especially when he does something as intimate as, join with the female changeling, that he lets that become his existence, and just like, fuck it, I don't care, and Rom gets caught trying to sabotage the emitter, and he gets sentenced to death, and it's such an intense moment, and God damn it, it was just so good. And also, like, the episode itself starts out with like Kira and Rom like instigating this fight between the Cardassians and Jem'Hadar because they wanted to keep them off guard, and they fucking like start snapping their backs and killing each other, and Quark's fire is like, this episode is so good. Anyway, let me move over to my number 6 favorite episode of Deep Space Nine, and that is The Visitor. Classic episode, very renowned episode for good reason. I think this is definitely the Benjamin and Jake father-son relationship at its best. It's very relatable. Anyone can relate to this episode. It's just so powerful. Okay, so I love, like, it starts out in the future and it goes back in time. Has old Jake Sisko who's about to die, tells a narrative story about how his father died, but he didn't really die. He's just trapped in this weird subspace bubble thingy. And so I love the impact that had on Jake's life, because he even said, like, usually if people lose loved ones, it happens. They just move on. But he couldn't move on, because every time he started to move on, the father would reappear again. And so there was always a possibility that he'd be able to save him. So he ended up, like, just ruining his entire life. And I think this episode is beautifully acted, both with Sarah McLachlan and Tony Todd, who played the future Jake. I think it was perfect. I mean, it's just perfectly directed. It's just because you can see in that future timeline, how regretful the senior Jake Sisko is, and how much he wants to change everything, and how he realizes now that he threw everything away, and because of his obsession, and the conversation that he has with the young lady who's like an aspiring writer, like that was such a beautiful conversation. I absolutely loved their interactions there. I really identified with her, and she could, really feel the pain that Jake was going through. So I thought that was an absolutely amazing, narrative structure to structure the episode about. And then, of course, you had the moments like when Benjamin first appeared to Jake on Deep Space Nine, has the energy thingy, and then when he just vanished out of nowhere, Jake like crying, saying, "Don't leave me!" Like, that was so effective. You could really feel his pain. And then you had the older Jake who basically threw his life away to study. Try to figure out a way to save his father, and then they go to the Defiant and try to bring him back. And that scene was just so emotional, so powerful. When Benjamin sees that how obsessed he's become, and how he threw his life away, and he's like, "Please promise me to get your life in order, God!" And how he grabbed Jake, and at this point, Jake's older, and he is like. Such a great, powerful scene. But of course, the ending was extremely powerful as well because, of course, Senior Jake figures out the way to fix it, and that's to kill himself at the exact moment that Benjamin appears. That way, Benjamin will go right back to the incident and will be able to prevent it from happening. And again, such a touching scene. Like, the music in this episode was beautiful. The acting was beautiful. This is just such a well-constructed, beautiful episode. Okay, so now it is top 5 time. Let me now get into the top 5 best episodes of Deep Space Nine. Again, you might think, oh, why is The Visitor only number 6? But this is the best of the best. These episodes are all amazing in my eyes. Anyway, let's get to my number 5, which is Tacking Into the Wind. So this is also from the 10 episodes story arc that closes out the show. This is my favorite from that story arc, as I think it's an absolutely amazing episode because it's a very unique episode. So it has the conclusion of the storyline setup of Kira and Odo and Garrick trying to help Damar's resistance cell, and he had this tension with Rasat, who was Damar's second-hand man, and how he's an asshole, and he keeps pushing Kira, and she can tell that he's pushing him, and at one point Garrick even says, "Oh, you're gonna have to kill him." That's so perfect to Garrick, and I love that Garrick is like completely on Kira's side because I think that makes total sense for his character because he can realize he doesn't give a fuck about helping the Federation or Starfleet. He wants to do what's best for Cardassia, but he's smart enough to, and not prideful like these other guys like Rusat is, to realize that Kira and Odo and the Federation are their best hope. It's Cardassian's best hope, but the Rusat guy is too prideful, he's too arrogant, and Garrick recognizes this because he's spent his whole life dealing with arrogant, asshole Cardassians, so he knows he can weed them out, and he's like, "You're gonna have to kill him." And then at the end of and also you have Odo, who is succumbing to the disease. He's hiding it from Kira, even though Garrick knows it, and he tells Kira, but she knows it anyway, even though he doesn't think he knows it. But just again, this is another example of the beautiful Kira and Odo relationship, which I absolutely loved. I think it was done very well, extremely well in this episode when Odo collapses from the disease after impersonating a female changeling, because they go on a Jem'Hadar ship and they have this other Vorta we meet, Luar, and they kill her because they're pretending to be the female shapeshifter, and God, it was so good. And then he collapses, and the episode ends with Kira cradling him, and Odo's just like, "Don't pity me, let's just sit here in silence." That was such a powerful moment. But backtracking a bit, you have the Mexican standoff. I mean, this is very Tarantino-esque. This is an amazing moment in Star Trek. This is something Star Trek usually doesn't do. It's something that's definitely very unique to Deep Space Nine. The Mexican standoff, where you have Rasat finally freaks out and he pulls his phaser on Kira and wants to kill her, but Garrick pulls his phaser on Rasat, and then Damar pulls his phaser on Garrick. So you have this cool phaser thing. It's so intense. It was so fucking intense. And I love how Rasat was just goading Kira, and is like, "No more. We had enough of this. And I'm taking care of you." And Garrick's just like, "I'm still here, Rasat." And then he begs Damar to kill Garrick, but instead he kills Rasat because Damar realizes he's smart enough to realize, like Garrick, to see his point of view, to put his arrogance aside and do what's best for Cardassia. So good. And on top of that amazing storyline, you also had the accumulation of the storyline with Gowron trying to fuck up the Klingon Empire for his own political pride, trying to disgrace Martok, and in the meantime, he's risking the entire war effort because the Klingon ships are the only ships that are immune to the Breen weapon, and he's just throwing them away just to make Martok look bad. And Worf gives a nice, I love the conversation he has with Ezri, where Ezri just points out, look, these are despicable politicians who are just fucking everything up for their own personal gain. So if the Klingon Empire tolerates that sort of thing, then the Klingon Empire is doomed. I'm sorry. I wish someone would have that conversation nowadays. But anyway, but it's so great how Worf challenges Gowron to fight to the death, and he of course kills Gowron in the one-on-one battle, which is the perfect accumulation of Worf's storyline, not just his Deep Space Nine storyline, but even starting on Next Generation. Like, this is such a great accumulation, and Worf of course doesn't want to be Emperor. He gives it to Martok because he knows Martok would be a better Emperor and someone who's more respected and more better able and willing to rule, even though Martok doesn't want to be Emperor. But Worf knows that's why he would make a good Emperor. Those who don't like it, who don't ask for it, they're the ones who are most capable. But because it's not about pride. For Gowron, it's always about power and pride and arrogance. And Martok has none of that, so that's how he knows he'd be a great leader. So, god damn it, that was amazing too. Also, you get the storyline with Bashir and O'Brien, like figuring out that Section 31 wasn't responsible for giving Odo the disease because they were hoping that he'd give it to the Founders, which they did. So they're basically willing to commit genocide. So Bashir and O'Brien come up with a plan to get the better of them, which actually does work out in another episode that's not in my countdown, but it was a good setup for that. So, such a great, powerful episode. Anyway, we'll move over to my number 4 favorite episode of Deep Space Nine, and that is Sacrifice of Angels. So, this is the final episode in the Dominion takeover of the station story arc of season 6. This is the accumulation of everything, and I think this episode, it has some of the best, battle sequences, like space battles, in the entire show. Like, it was absolutely amazing. It was really intense, and as I talked about Favor the Bold already, it was perfectly set up for. We have this intense, and this episode just jumps right into it, into this intense storyline of the Defiant with this huge fleet of Starfleet ships, but they couldn't wait, so it's not as huge as they want because they're outnumbered almost 2-1 by the Dominion fleet, but they're still struggling, they're still trying, but eventually you do have the Klingons finally show up and help them and help the Defiant break through the lines, which is like such great battle sequences. But on top of that, you have the whole storyline on the station with Dukat trying to mend fences with his daughter, and his daughter realizes how big of an asshole Dukat is because he's not willing to help Ram or the others, so she ends up helping Quark free Kira and Ram and the others from the holding cell so they can go sabotage the station in time to take down the minefield. You get these awesome action sequences of like running through the corridors of Deep Space Nine, firing phasers, and Odo finally comes to his fucking senses because Kira told him off for being a dick. He finally comes to his senses with Bajoran forces and saves Kira, and so they go to to sabotage the Miners so the Dominion can take down the minefield, but they're 1 second too late. I mean, god damn it! That was so intense. That was so great, and the fucking minefield comes down, the Defiant shows up to see like the wormhole open up, so like a billion Jem'Hadar ships about to come pouring through the wormhole to kill them all. So just for the fuck of it, Benjamin takes the Defiant in, and of course when he's in the wormhole, the prophets contact him, and he begs the prophets to intervene, so the prophets make the entire Jem'Hadar fleet disappeared, and so the Dominion fucked, and they have to leave. Like, that was amazing. Now, I had talked about this whole Deus Ex Machina argument, which I think is very falsely applied here. I don't think this is Deus Ex Machina because I think the intervention of the wormhole aliens was set up for, it was established that the wormhole aliens want to protect Bajor, and the wormhole is right there. And so it's not like the writers wrote themselves into a corner they couldn't get out of, because they could have easily just had Kira sabotage the minefield before it went off. But this is a lot more exciting, and they wanted to include the prophets into the storyline because I think it makes sense to include the prophets in the storyline because they're there, they're involved. They should get involved in the Dominion War, and it makes sense that they would have the power to intercede. And plus, that makes the whole need for minefields unnecessary in the future because now the Dominion fleet can't get through the wormhole because the prophets won't let them. And that does make a lot of sense. It was established in the very first episode that the prophets can, or the wormhole aliens, however you want to call them, can stop ships from going through the wormhole. The only reason ships go through the wormhole is because they let them. And so, if there's such a force that, if they care about Bajor, which recent years they were established to care about Bajor, they wouldn't want to let these ships in. So I loved it. I think this whole episode was amazing. And then, of course, Damar kills Dial because she betrayed them. And Dukat goes fucking loopy and insane. And they leave him behind. He's saying, "Oh, you are my daughter." Like, what a great ending for Dukat. Although we know that's not the ending. They kind of didn't know what to do with him for the rest of season 6. But I think they recovered in season 7. So, yeah. Great, amazing episode. Alright, so now let me get into my number 3, third best episode of Deep Space Nine, The Quickening. So I think this is an underrated episode. I don't know, I haven't seen many people who love this episode as much as me, but I think this is one of the most powerful pieces of fiction I've ever viewed. It's just, alright, it's such a good character story for Bashir. And I was talking about, in my worst episode list, how it was kind of a cheat to make him genetically engineered, where you could do good, great character stories without that. And if the writers weren't being lazy. And this is a prime example of that. This, such a really well-structured episode. So, Bashir goes to this planet that's suffering from this, unstoppable, uncurable disease, and everyone there, they've been living with this disease for so long. They've just integrated it into their culture, and they just come to accept that there's absolutely no getting rid of it because it's a genetically engineered disease, engineered by the Dominion to punish those who would defy the Dominion. And that's in character with the Dominion. And it was just such a creepy, effectively creepy episode. And I love how Bashir isn't really, I don't think he's actually in the right here because he's coming in all, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, whatever the saying is, and coming in with this Federation morals and being like, "Oh, how dare you kill people who are sick, blah, blah, blah," because he doesn't know. He is unaware of what the culture had to endure, what it had to deal with. It had to deal with people promising cures and just ripping them off. And so they've grown to be very suspicious of outsiders. And I think that I like the Bashir and Trevine relationship, and I don't think either one are in the right. They just have, or in the wrong. They have their different perspectives. Because you could say Trevine was being a bit naive because Bashir actually could help him, and he was being a bit of a dick to Bashir when Bashir ends up creating a vaccine. But you gotta see it from his perspective, is that they've been duped before, and he's not a total outright asshole to Bashir. He doesn't try to kill him. I think that would be cheesy. He doesn't even try to kick him off the planet. He just tries to discourage people from going to Bashir. And I like that. I like that blend because it shows that he's not an evil villain bad guy. He's just weary of outsiders. But he's trying to do the right thing. And in his mind, doing the right thing is ending the suffering. So that's ending people's lives before they go through this phase known as the quickening. That is extremely painful, and then they die, which I think makes the most sense in the world. And I think both of these two characters come to see from the other's perspective by the end, because Bashir, of course, has got the perspective of how can you be a healer if you kill people? The whole thing is to try to heal them, try to take away their pain, try to make them better. Why are these people giving up? But I think he's learned by the end of it why they've given up, because they've lived with this so long, and he himself. I love the personal character development in Bashir in this episode, because he comes in at the start being, "Oh, I'm going to be awesome. Why are these people killing the others? They're so dumb. I'm going to come in and cure everything." And it doesn't. He tries his best. He ends up making things worse. People like going through the quickening, dying and suffering because of him. And he has to live with this humility. And I love it by the end of the episode. He's talking about how arrogant he was and how downtrodden he was, but he instead decides to stick with it, and he has this assistant, someone from the species who lives on the planet who's pregnant, and the relationship that they form together. And by the end of the episode, I'm almost getting teary-eyed just thinking about this. And at the end of the episode, he's not able to save her, but he's able to save her child. He's able to give birth, to deliver her baby before she dies, and is free of the disease, and realizes that he has created a vaccine that can cure infants, even if it doesn't cure people who already have the disease. And my God, was that ending very effective. I mean, God, I had to admit, I was crying a couple times watching this episode. I'm almost tearing up just talking about it right now. I mean, that was such a powerful ending, and the way he presents the disease-free baby to Trevine, and Trevine again, well-intentioned good guy, once he realizes that there's a possibility that there's a vaccine that can cure the children, he totally changes his tune, and he's like, this is not going to be hard work, this isn't going to be a mission to deliver this vaccine all over the world, it's going to be a privilege. I mean, God damn it. And then you see Bashir at the end, back on Deep Space Nine, still working away, trying to come up with a cure, but he just can't do it. I love that. I love that it's not as like, oh, the good guys win and Bashir cures the vid and everything's good. Most Star Trek episodes would do that. This is Deep Space Nine. This is what happens in Deep Space Nine. It has a more complex, more dark, more dynamic ending, and that's why this show is the best Star Trek show. That's why this show is so fucking amazing. Anyway, speaking of episodes that are fucking amazing, let me get into my top 2 best Deep Space Nine episodes, and starting with my number 2, In the Pale Moonlight. Now, yes, it's a close one between this and number 1. I would say that these top 2 episodes aren't just the top 2 episodes of Deep Space Nine. These are my top 2 episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. So this is my second favorite episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, In the Pale Moonlight, which, again, this is uniquely Deep Space Nine. So, I heard some people say, oh, this is controversial because it doesn't portray the Federation or Starfleet officers in the best light. But I love that. I love that they're willing to take the risk, because they've established there's a Dominion war going on and that they're losing the war. So that puts strain. And they kind of mentioned this in the episode Past Tense, where Bashir was back in the 21st century, and he was like, I wonder, like, if our Federation and Starfleet were in dire straits and they were low on resources and they were in real trouble, would we go back to being as fucked up as we are now? And in this episode we see that, yeah, they would. And you actually see that happen because Sisko is desperate because the Dominion take over Beta Z, and that was a bold ass fucking move. I don't care if the Beta Z's not that well known on the planet. It's just Counselor Troy who cares about her. But that was a well established planet in the Federation, and the Dominion fucking take it over, and so Sisko's desperate to bring the Romulans in the war because they need another powerful ally, and the Romulans won't join. He tries everything. So at first he's like, Garrick, why don't you find evidence that the Romulans are trying to attack Cardassia? And Garrick tries his best. He's like, everyone I contact died. And he's like, oh, fuck. That's really hard. And Garrick's like, I got an idea. And if you really want to find evidence that, the Dominion's going to attack Romulus, let's just create that evidence ourselves. And I have a love-hate relationship with the captain's log dynamic of this episode, because sometimes Avery Brooks overacting is a bit over the top. People are dying every day! Like, okay, cool it a bit. But I do think it's a really cool framing device, because it does enhance the episode a bit, because you get Sisko's perspective and how he's really. I love how he's coming from the perspective, even though the end result is he did get what he wanted. He was able to have the Romulans join the war, and he might have just saved the entire Alpha Quadrant, and yet he frames the narration of this as if everything went wrong, as if everything totally fucked up, as if this is one of the worst things he's ever done, because it kind of is, because he had to lie, cheat, be basically accomplished to murder. Like assist the murder, assassination, totally like deceive an entire government of people. And so even though he got the result he wanted, he was really and I love what it does to the narrative structure, because when you're first watching this episode, you think they're going to lose. You think this is going to go horribly wrong, because that's how Sisko's framing it. But it's actually, he's framing it that way because the cost that it had on his soul. And I think that really comes across strongly, and you really get that in Sisko's narration, particularly when he's saying, to Garrick, when Garrick comes up with his idea, he's like, you know what, I should have just let it go. I should have just been like, thanks for your suggestion, Garrick, I'll see you next time. But it was eating at him, because he knew that the Federation was in danger of being wiped out, and that his self-respect, his morals, just were not worth it. And this, I think, is the best use of Garrick. I love Garrick. I think he's the best character in Deep Space Nine, and maybe the entire franchise. He's just such a great character, and this is such good use of him, because he has no moral compunctions, and that's totally within his character. And I love how he is the one. I love that they use Garrick, not a one-off special guest or something. It's such good use of the characters they have. I love that he was the one that corrupted Sisko, that pushed him forward. And he had awesome scenes like how, because this guy, Grathon Tolar, who was like, ooh, like the stuff with him was so good, and how he attacked Quark, and Sisko had to bribe Quark to be quiet about it, because he didn't want there to be any record of that guy being on the station. I love that scene. The scene was so great, how Quark was like, he was so happy when Sisko was going to bribe him. He's like, are you offering me a bribe? Like, that is so great to Quark, because Quark could see that Sisko was stooping down to his level, and he loved it. He took pure delight in it. Oh, Mr. High and Mighty, I would never bribe and stuff. Now you're asking to bribe me. He's just reveling in it. It was so good. And of course, like the ending revelation, when I can't skip over the "it's a fake." Like, I heard some people complain about this acting. Get the hell out of here! It's a fake. Like, that was beautiful. That was amazing. That was such a good scene. Because I described this as a Ned Stark losing his head moment, but I think it's better than that, honestly. This is like one of the most shocking, profound moments in TV history, because at this moment, this is Star Trek. In Star Trek, the good guys always win. There's never any really hiccups. So when you see that Sisko's going to try to pull this con, of course it's going to go off. Of course it's going to work. Of course he's going to buy it. And so when they're saying, this whole moment where Sisko's like, now it's just for him to take this recording of this Romulan that they fabricated, and for him to find out it's true. Because of course it's going to work. They got this criminal to make it work, and they had this authentic rod, so of course it's going to work. But he comes up and he says it's a fake. Blew me away. Blew my mind. That was such a fucking powerful moment. And I like the performance. I don't get why people don't like it. I think it's perfect. It makes sense that Senator Vreenak would be outraged and would go, it's a fake, like that, because he's an asshole. And I love the actor who played Vreenak. He did such a good job of portraying like this despicable, slimy Romulan who hates humans, and the fact that he's vindicated, that he discovers that Sisko is trying to deceive him. That was the perfect reaction to it. And then And then so you're like, oh, things are fucked. And at this stage, you're like, okay, so this is why Sisko's so depressed in his log. That's why he thinks everything's gone wrong, because the Romulans are actually could actively even join the war against them and join the Dominion side because they fucked up so badly. But no. This was all part of Garrick's plan. Oh my god, this is such good fucking use of Garrick. That Garrick's plan, because he thought that, he hoped that Tolar would be able to pull it off, but he kind of thought that he wouldn't. And so he had a backup plan, of course. And his backup plan was to plant a bomb on Senator Vrynek's ship, blow up the ship, assassinate the senator, and because of the explosion, they would find the rod destroyed, and so they would think it's authentic because, any inconsistencies in it would be explained away by the explosion. And so the Romulans discover it, and they join the war. So Sisko gets what he wants. And that scene, oh my god, that scene where Benjamin goes down to Garrick's shop and just punches him and starts screaming at him, was such a good scene. It was such a beautiful scene. It was one of the best, well-acted, well-constructed, well-written, powerful, emotional scenes in the fucking Star Trek franchise. This was the best use of Garrick, best use of Sisko, and just such a powerful scene altogether. Such a good episode. Alright. Speaking of amazing acting, speaking of amazing scenes, speaking of amazing dialogue, let me get into my number one favorite episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and that, of course, is the first season episode, Duet. And it's so amazing that the best episode of the show, the best episode of the franchise, came out of this first season of Deep Space Nine. And the first season was very subpar, but they really hit it with this episode. It's just beautiful the way things, and it's funny because I think they did this episode as a bottle episode because they're running out of money, and it's funny when they run out of money they end up doing something that's way better than the stuff they do with money. It's kind of ironic, I guess, because and I think part of the reason why I love this episode so much, I call it the best episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, is because of my personal preference of how much I love dialogue-based stories, because I think they're harder to pull off, especially stories like this that are super intense and suspenseful, and they do it simply through dialogue. That is a very hard task. It's something that's very hard to pull off. I've seen a lot of movies and shows that try to do it and they fail because it's not easy to do. So I think I really got to give this episode credit. And not only is it powerfully suspenseful through the use of dialogue, but it's very emotional as well. Like this I think it's an understatement to say how emotionally impactful this episode is. This episode really brings up the feel, really brings the weight of what the Bajoran people suffered through in the Cardassian occupation, more so than any other episode, because you see it on Kira's face, you see it through her expressions, you see it through the way that she interacts with this Gol who's taking responsibility for atrocities and loving it. How despicable is that? It's like, what you call genocide, I call day's work. And he's like, I did what had to be done. They're Bajoran scum, and I killed them. I murdered them, and he's proud of it. Oh my god, that was just so fucking intense, and the way that Kira's storyline was built in this episode was so good. First, she's on this vendetta to get this guy, because at first he says he's just a file clerk. She's like, no, I don't want, and she even said this when she was talking to Dex, I don't want him to be a file clerk. I want him to be something worse. And it turns out she got her wish, and it's not really what she bargained for. And she had to sit there and listen to this guy brag about murdering and torturing her people in the worst ways, and brag about it like he's happy about it. And oh my god, like he said, and when she's like, and eventually he even said this because she wants to get satisfaction on capturing and killing and murdering or not murdering, but giving justice to this mass murder. But he's taking all of the enjoyment out of it, because he even says, he's like, kill me, torture me. You've already lost. Anything you did to me doesn't matter, but you've already lost. The dead cannot never come back. You can never undo what I have done. And that is gum. Damn it. That is so chilling. That is such a chilling, powerful scene. Like, those interrogation scenes between Kira and Maritza were just, oh my god, this is some of the most electric, most powerful, most innovative, most just intriguing, capturing interactions I've ever seen put to film, to any kind of visual medium ever. And I'm sorry, some people say that Nana Visitor's acting here is not so good. Get the fuck out of here. Her acting was amazing in this episode. So was Harris Yulin, who played Maritza. Like, oh my god, this was the performance for the fucking ages. It was just so good. Now, on top of that, you get this other storyline of Odo and Bashir starting to realize they're getting a sniff that something's not really right here about his story. Something's not really adding up. And Kira's being completely oblivious and blind to this, because she has to deal with this fuckhead who's bragging about killing her people. So she just wants him to suffer in the worst possible ways, which is could not possibly be more understandable. So she's kind of blinded to the fact that something's not right here. Something's not adding up. And so you get the storyline of Odo and Bashir like investigating, and eventually they find out this guy's lying. He's not this mass murderer. He's making up a story. And so what's the deal? Why is he making up the story? And then you get the powerful ending, the powerful scene where you find out that he's just making this all up because he wants to humiliate Cardassia. He wants Cardassia to admit his guilt. He wants Cardassia to change. Because he himself feels guilty, because he actually was a file clerk at this horrible internment camp, and he had to listen to Bajorn's torture, and he was just like crying in his bed because he felt bad, he couldn't do anything about it, and he feels guilty for doing nothing about it. I'm almost crying just talking about this. That's so powerful. That's so fucking powerful. And then you get this other twist ending, which I heard some people complain about, which again, get the fuck out of here. This ending was amazing, where the Bajoran, who was like, a criminal who's bitching about the Cardassian, just comes up and fucking stabs him in the back, which, some people think, oh, there's too many twists on twists. But here's the thing, this is why the wrong, objectively wrong, in this ending is beautiful. This ending is perfect, because it illustrates how blind hate, even if it seems like it's justified, because again, we heard about all the atrocities that the Cardassians committed, all the murders, the rapes, the torture, and this episode it really accentuates it. The first part of the episode makes it hit home, makes it clear just how horrible the Cardassians were. So you think it would be justified for Epijorn to kill a Cardassian in revenge. But no, because this is someone who was actually felt guilty about it, someone who was tortured by it, someone who was willing to give his own life just for the chance that Cardassian might admit of their wrongdoing, just for some sort of tinge and feeling of redemption, of doing the right thing. He was willing to give his entire life. But Kira stopped him because she saw what a good man that he was, and that Cardassian needed people like him, that Bajor needed people like him, people who were willing to stand up against evil. And then this guy just fucking kills him, and he does it because of hate, because he just, he's a Cardassian, I hate him, kill him, not thinking about it. And I think this ending's perfect. I don't think it's too out there, because people do kill people in hate crimes like this. And I think it just made it even more powerful. Like seeing Kira cradling him. And, this good man that she wanted to kill just a few moments earlier, she realized was the best man, and he is a victim of hate as well. That is fucking powerful. I can't think of anything more powerful than that. That is just so fucking good. This episode is the height of emotional, good powerful storytelling that's very analogous to real life situations that speak against hate, that speak against prejudice. It's nothing in Star Trek does it as well as this episode. And this episode's got a fucking amazing acting, amazing dialogue, it's intriguing, it's suspenseful, it's got every fucking thing you possibly want. And nothing is groundbreaking and powerful as this episode. Anyway, that is it. That is it for my top 50 favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine. I thank you very much for sitting through this long video to watch this. So that is it for my coverage of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. As I said, I covered every single episode of Deep Space Nine, one season at a time. If you haven't watched that yet, go check that out. Next month, I'm going to tackle Star Trek Enterprise, which is going to be really tough to get through those first 2 seasons, but then the 3rd and 4th season will reward me. But man, I'm going to have a rough couple of months. So if you want to hear me rant and yell and swear and say the word fuck a lot, then check out my coverage of the first 2 seasons of Enterprise, because goddamn they suck. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this. Thank you if you watched all my Deep Space Nine coverage, thank you so much for sticking with me for that. Be sure to check out my channel as I cover many other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.